My parents disappear every October 31st. I don't mean they'd leave for a party or a night out. No, they'd vanish, gone without a trace by sunset, leaving me alone in the house. I'd search for them, call their names, but they were always gone, like they'd never existed. It wasn't something we ever talked about. The next morning, they'd be back, acting as if nothing had happened, like it was just another night. But it wasn't. I knew that. I learned that the hard way. It all started when I was 6 years old. I remember that first Halloween like it was yesterday. I was dressed as a witch, excited to go trick-or-treating. But just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed the house felt different, cold, quiet, too quiet. I ran through the halls, calling for my mom and dad, but no one answered. Panic set in. I thought maybe they were hiding, playing a prank, but after what felt like hours of searching, I realized they were gone. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and I was completely alone. That's when I found the first note. It was on the kitchen table, written in my mom's familiar handwriting. It simply said, "Rule 1, stay in your room. Do not come out until sunrise. Whatever you hear, ignore it." I didn't understand then. I was scared, confused, and alone. I didn't want to stay in my room. I wanted to find my parents. But something about the note made me follow the instructions. I took a flashlight and a pillow, locked myself in my room, and crawled under the covers. I thought maybe it was some kind of weird game. I wasn't sure. That night, I didn't sleep much. The house creaked and groaned, more than usual. I heard strange noises, soft scratching at my door, footsteps in the hallway, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in the house with me. The next morning, when I opened my door, my parents were back. They were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. I asked them where they'd gone, what had happened, but they just smiled and said I must have had a bad dream. That was the beginning. Every Halloween after that was the same. My parents would disappear just before nightfall, leaving me alone with a note. Each year, the instructions got a little more specific, a little more ominous. By the time I was 8, the notes included things like Rule 2, don't look out the windows, and Rule 3, don't respond if someone calls your name. And the noises, they got worse. One year, when I was 9, the sounds outside my room became unbearable. There were knocks on the door, not gentle, but loud, insistent pounding. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but I couldn't block it out. The voice on the other side was familiar, my mother's voice, calling my name. "Ellie, it's okay. You can come out now." She sounded so calm, so normal. For a second, I almost believed it was really her. But the rule had been clear, do not open the door, no matter what you hear. So I didn't. I stayed under the covers, trembling, until the knocking stopped. I never told my parents about the voice, and they never asked. The years passed, and the game continued. It became a twisted Halloween tradition. While other kids dressed up and collected candy, I stayed locked in my room, listening to the house come alive with things I couldn't see. I became used to the notes, the strange noises, and the feeling of being watched. It was all part of the game, my own haunted ritual. But when I turned 13, everything changed. That year, the note was different. I found it on my bed just as the sun was setting, but instead of the usual instructions, it said, "Rule 4, There's something new in the house tonight. Be careful. I didn't know what that meant, but the moment I read it, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something new? What did that mean? I locked my door, as usual, and tried to settle in for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The noises started earlier than usual. At first, it was the familiar creaks and footsteps. I'd gotten used to those. But then, there was something else, breathing. I could hear it, low and heavy, just outside my door. It wasn't human. It was too slow, too deep. I pressed myself against the headboard, clutching my flashlight like a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The breathing moved away after a while, but then came the scratching. It wasn't at my door this time, it was coming from inside my room. I whipped the flashlight around, scanning the walls, the ceiling, but there was nothing. The scratching grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from beneath my bed. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat dry with fear. I didn't dare look under the bed. I was too scared of what I might find. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, childlike giggle. The sound of it froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't me. It wasn't my parents. Something was in the room with me. I backed up against the wall, holding the flashlight out in front of me like it could protect me from whatever was there. The giggling continued, soft and mocking. I whispered to myself, "It's not real. It's just a game." But I didn't believe it anymore. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. The whole room seemed to shake with the force of it. I dropped the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. The breathing was back, but this time, it was right outside my door. Bang! Another hit. The door shuddered. Bang! The lock rattled. Whatever was out there was trying to get in. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The banging grew more violent, each hit sounding like the door was about to give in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Pure, deafening silence. I held my breath, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. Then, the voice returned, soft and sweet, like honey. "Ellie, it's okay. You can come out now." It was my mother's voice again, but this time, I knew it wasn't her. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen in fear, praying for the night to end. The voice called out again, more insistent this time. "Ellie, don't be scared. It's just a game." My hands were trembling, and I could barely hold onto the flashlight. The voice kept calling, but I stayed silent. I knew the rules. I knew I couldn't open the door. But then, something strange happened. The door, it began to unlock. I heard the soft click of the lock turning, and the handle slowly twisted. "No," I whispered, pressing myself further against the wall, willing the door to stay shut. But it was too late. The door creaked open, just a crack, but enough for me to see a shadow in the hallway, something tall and thin, its limbs too long, its fingers clawed. It wasn't my mother. The creature stood in the doorway, unmoving, watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I might pass out. And then, just as it stepped forward, the first rays of sunlight crept through the window. The creature recoiled, hissing like an animal, and within seconds, it was gone. The door slammed shut, and the house was quiet again. I didn't leave my room until the sun was fully up. When I finally opened the door, the house was just as it had been the night before, silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. My parents were back, sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee like they always did. I stumbled in, shaken and pale, and told them everything, the creature, the scratching, the voice that wasn't my mother's. They just looked at me, exchanged glances, and then my dad laughed softly. "You must have had a bad dream," he said, shaking his head. "Nothing like that happened, Ellie. It was just your imagination." My mom smiled that same strange smile and added, "You're safe now. It's over." But I knew better. I knew it wasn't just a dream. The fear, the things I'd heard and seen, they were real. They had to be. My parents didn't believe me, they never did, and that was the most terrifying part. Now, as an adult with children of my own, I know the truth. Whatever haunted me in that house, whatever played that sick game, it's still out there, waiting. And it's hungry. I fear for the lives of my children. I'll never let them go through what I went through. I'll protect them at all costs, even if it means never celebrating Halloween, never letting the night touch them the way it touched me. Because I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before the game starts again. Halloween is coming. The Paperboy. I couldn't tell you the first time it happened, and I wish I could tell you the final time it will happen. A boy who would appear to be maybe 12 or so rides on an old rusty bike and tosses the paper with such precision, one could assume he'd have a promising career with the Boston Red Sox. Heck, he'd probably soar in the NFL too. But something was seriously off about the kid. He didn't show up every single morning. But when he came, you knew it. You could hear his rusty bike chain struggling. It was as if the noise itself was elevated by invisible speakers. He would throw the paper dead center of everyone's doorstep. The paper didn't have a name such as the New York Times or whatever your hometown has. It was just simply blank. I remember the first paper I got. I woke up extremely tired from a sleepless night. I brewed some coffee and opened the door to see the leaves falling. That's when I seen the paper. Local restaurant closes down today. I didn't think much of it. Restaurants close all the time. It's one of the hardest businesses to maintain. It wasn't until I pulled up to my favorite Chinese restaurant that they announced on the door they were closed for good, no explanation. Months go by and I seen him riding down to the next house on the street. I picked up the paper again. Drunk driver crashes today. Sure enough, a man in our town drove his car into a used car lot, damaging one that was for sale. The man was over double the legal limit according to my cousin who is a cop. 6 months go by and another one. Jacob dies by stabbing. There's a lot of people named Jacob. Many of those people I'm sure were superstitious and stayed in home that day. The news crew were outside someone's home and said it was an active crime scene. They never did find who did it. At least a year went by when I heard the bike pedaling again. I ran outside and the paper landed at my feet. Full moon tonight, be cautious. A homeless person was mutilated in the park. They believed it to be some sort of wild animal. The rest of the paper every time was like any other, filled with weather and advertisements. No one ever tried to stop the paperboy to my knowledge. 4 months go by and I see him pedaling. I jog towards him. "Hey, quit sending out these papers. Please." He turned his head and spoke back to me. I could have sworn his eyes were pitch black. "Just doing my job, I don't write these." The paper went dead center of my porch step. Factory supervisor involved in terrible accident. I wasn't at work for 15 minutes when people began freaking out. A temp on a forklift collided with one of our supervisors and he was impaled. He died before the ambulance sirens lit up the rainy parking lot. I don't know what made me think it was a great idea, but a year and a half goes by when I spotted him again. I charged towards him on his bike and he tossed a paper so hard, it knocked me flat on my back. Just wait until you get the next one. You'll regret doing that. I sat up and looked at the paper. Body found with all blood gone. The town mayor was found with bite marks on his neck. All the blood on his body was drained. I lived in paranoia the entire day wondering what he meant. A day goes by when the paperboy came back. Tim gets what he deserved. Shit, that's me. I run back in the house and lock the door when I heard an audible voice. You think you can avoid this? A man comes from my kitchen. He's wearing black pants and a white dress shirt. He's wearing a fedora and black suspenders. He was straight in his tie. His eyes were pitch black and the smell of rotting eggs filled the room. His arms stretched from across the room and grabbed me by my throat. He picked me up and slammed me against my ceiling and dropped me to my hardwood floor. He picked up my couch and threw it on top of me. I tried to crawl away when I felt his arms start wrapping around my neck as if they were a snake squeezing the life out of its dinner. He flipped me around and opened his mouth. Razor-sharp teeth similar to a shark's plunged into my shoulder. I let out a scream and tried throwing a punch but was too weak. I woke up in the hospital. My neighbor heard all the commotion and left. He explained he's seen a well-dressed man walking down the street and finding me in a puddle of my blood. They didn't have any trouble believing him. Once I made it home, I stumbled to the porch and seen another paper on my step. Local paper closing down once a sacrifice is made. This time there were words below the headline. Fellow citizens of this great community, it is with our deepest regret to inform you that we decided to close shop under one specific condition. The condition being that you all choose one person to sacrifice. The decision is up to you all by majority vote. We have plans to set up shop in another town somewhere we choose not to share at the time. However, failure to pick a sacrifice will result in daily paper deliveries, many more creative than the next. Every childless adult is required to attend. I never seen town hall so full of people and such chaos. Of course no one volunteered. The person was selected after people took their turns speaking. Every business was closed down that day. The person chosen was a man in jail for producing and dealing meth. He didn't know what was happening when he was walked in front of all of us. I still hear his voice say, "What's going on?" The officer said, "I'm sorry." Bang. We never did get any more papers delivered, but the guilt has clearly eaten up this city. I'm not sure if they plan on coming to your town or whoever's town, but I am completely convinced they cannot be stopped. He won't leave me alone. This all started at the grocery store. I was in the freezer section debating on which chicken nuggets to get when in the reflection of the freezer glass I saw a large dark figure behind me. As I turned around I saw a large man inches in front of me. He was so close I could feel his breath cascade down on my skin. This man was very tall and dressed in plain clothes. He had a familiar aura about him, though I could not recognize him for the life of me. I had assumed I was in his way and excused myself, shifting out from in front of him and deciding to just continue my shopping elsewhere. As I walked out of that aisle I looked over my shoulder and saw him in the same spot but turned towards me just glaring. This really gave me bad vibes and I just decided to check out and go home early. I thought that perhaps he was just a strange man that enjoyed gawking at women and had poor social skills. That night I just did not stop thinking about him though. I have had many strange interactions with strangers in the past, but this one had affected me in a way I had never felt. The next morning I still had bad feelings about the whole thing, and as I was brushing my teeth I felt afraid of the mirror and reflections. Perhaps this is due to first seeing the man in the reflection of the glass, I thought. I proceeded to get ready for work and headed to the bus stop. As I sat at the bus stop, my mood lightened. The day was beautiful, and I had finally started forgetting about that strange man in the grocery store. I got on the nearly empty bus and quickly got distracted on my phone. The next time I looked up, my eyes meandered to the rearview mirror where I could see an unbelievable horror sitting directly behind me. Goosebumps formed on my arms as I swear I could see the man from the day before with the same sinister glare. I hadn't seen him get on the bus. I had no clue how long he had been sitting there, and all I felt was this sense of disgust. This was probably all a coincidence, but there I was seeing this abhorrent man yet again. I hated everything about him. Many people would probably see a very unassuming person, but I knew differently. I knew I had seen him before, and I just knew he was evil. I still could not remember where I knew him from, and didn't really care to remember. I got off the bus at a stop one before my normal stop, terrified of the idea of him knowing where I work. I was also terrified he would follow me off the bus. Luckily, when I got off, he stayed on. I saw him staring at me through the window with that same horrific look. I knew this look had to be of longing, of envy, of lust. Why else would he stare in such a way? He wanted me, I could tell. In that moment it felt like I could read his mind, as if our minds were the same. I could understand every nuance of thoughts behind those cruel eyes. I sat at work feeling paranoid and uneasy all day. Every noise I heard would make me jump and look around. I kept staring out the window, terrified I would see him staring back at me, and every now and then I could swear I saw him in the reflection of the glass, either standing behind me or next to me. I knew he wanted me. I had to get help and called my friend, but he just laughed at me and said I must be on edge from stress or something. I hated that I sounded crazy because I knew the truth. I knew the danger I was in. I also tried telling my boss, but she just asked if I needed some time off and also suggested it was stress-related. After speaking to her, I walked to the bathroom, and while washing my hands, I looked up into the mirror. I screamed in horror, because I swear I saw him staring back at me for a moment. My boss knocked on the door and asked what was wrong, but she could never understand. I was sent home for the week after that. No one could understand how the man made me feel. He was making me paranoid. The intent behind his eyes alone was enough to make me feel his presence no matter where I was. I made it home without incident and everything was feeling good. My first mistake was letting my guard down. I should have known he would never stop to get to me. I no longer felt his presence and had assumed I was safe from his evil glare. I started watching TV and chilling with my cat. Everything was going fine when suddenly it was as if I could hear his thoughts again. I knew he wanted to hurt me. For fuck's sake, his very existence hurt me. He would not stop until he got to me, till I was his. This evil man was stalking me. That is why he was at the grocery store and on the bus. He must have followed me to work as well, or why else would I see him in reflections? I could feel his presence ever since I first saw him. I think I had to confront him. It was the only way to make him stop his terrible plans. I returned to the grocery store hoping to find him there. As I walked through the aisles, I kept hearing his thoughts louder and louder. Many people I passed looked at me like I was insane. I was pacing the aisles over and over, so I probably did look insane. Eventually, a woman working at the store stopped me, and she did the most foul thing a person could do. She referred to me as sir, and she went on to explain how I was terrifying other customers. She cited my large stature and rude look in my eyes as reasons why. This cruel woman could see the man in me. Had he taken me already? Was I too late to confront him? I looked over at the reflection on the glass of the freezer aisle. Instead of seeing him next to me like before, he was on top of me, or he was me. I fled the store just trying to run home to get away from that foul man. I knew he wanted to hurt me. Why would that lady mistake me for him? Why would I mistake myself for him? What is happening to me? His perverse thoughts wouldn't leave my head. I made it home in record time, rushing inside and to the bathroom mirror. Gazing into the mirror, I could see my femininity return to me. The man wasn't here, it was all a coincidence, all in my head. I gazed into my eyes, seeing myself. I was overjoyed, seeing soft features and a delicate look in my eyes. I should have known this wouldn't last for long. I should have known that detestable man would stop at nothing to have me. Even though I saw myself in the mirror, I could feel him in me. I could hear his thoughts. He wanted me. He wanted to be me. I had to confront him right then. I started scraping into my own skin on my face, thinking I could either pull him out or anger him by ruining my beauty. I could never imagine how difficult it would be to harm myself. I wanted so badly to scrape my own skin off, but it was as if I was scraping my nails against metal that refused to give way. I screamed at my own reflection as his thoughts were becoming unbearable. It gave me the power to rip into my face. My skin gave way to blood. I would get him out of me. This self-inflicted wound hurt more than anything I had ever felt besides his voice in my head. His presence wounded me more than any scratch or scrape. His thoughts were destroying me. I saw my face transform through this to something that at first I did not recognize. I just wanted to feel like myself, and I just wanted him to leave me alone forever. As I gazed back into my eyes, I saw them turn back into the cruel eyes of the man. I was becoming him again. I stared with so much intensity into the blood-covered face of a man that was becoming more recognizable by the moment. The more I stared, the more I understood. This man was me. He was always me. He took over fully now. His thoughts were mine. I felt so much distress still in that moment. I could not fathom how this man was me. I could swear I saw his unfamiliar face for the first time in that reflection. This was me. I had to come to terms with these eyes full of despair and malice. I had to come to terms with this stature and with this body that I feel is not mine. I crave femininity. I crave looking like her. The woman I believe I am, and the woman I swear I was a day ago. I took a job in a remote town, and now I'm being followed. First of all, I'd like to say that I've never really been a believer in the supernatural. Sure, I enjoy spooky stories, especially around this time of year, and I've definitely gone down a few rabbit holes exploring weird phenomena, but I wouldn't really call myself a true believer. I've asked for advice on this topic before, not here but on other forums, but nothing has ever worked. So, I figured that there's no harm in following some people's advice and sharing my story here, even though I'm not really sure what to expect from this. Back in January, my university shared a job opportunity from a school in Northern Ireland, looking for a recent graduate to join them as a Spanish teacher in the fall. At the time, I was in my final year of English studies at a university in Spain and wasn't really sure about what I wanted to do after graduation. So, I applied, not really expecting much to come out of it. To my surprise, less than 2 months later, I got a call for an interview, and soon after, I was officially offered the position. That led to a restless summer as I prepared for the life I was about to start. I had some reservations, but my parents had even more. The town where I would be teaching was so small and remote that it didn't even show up on Google Street View, and the nearest hospital was almost an hour's drive away. It was one of those aging towns with very few children, and as such, the school didn't just serve the local kids, it hosted children from nearby towns as well, with a total of about 10 to 15 students per grade, up to the 6th grade. The local convenience store was stocked only once a week, so I was warned not to expect too much variety, and on top of all of that, it was extremely cold. Despite all of this, I still felt drawn to go. The town was isolated, sure, but the photos I found online were breathtaking, and the small number of students would allow me to focus more on each of them. The limited options when it came to sustenance sounded harsh, but having a car was sure to help the situation at least a little bit. The salary was generous, too, as remote teaching jobs in such areas were hard to fill, and the offer of free housing didn't hurt either. Knowing how isolated the town was, I decided to bring my car and take my time driving through Spain, France, and Ireland. What should have been a 2-day journey turned into a week-long road trip. I took the scenic route, stopping at hotels and doing a little sightseeing along the way. I arrived at my new house late at night, after countless wrong turns and much cursing at Google Maps, hours after I was supposed to arrive. I thought I might have to spend the night in my car, but I was relieved to see a light still on inside the house. I knocked on the door and waited. After a couple of minutes with no response, I knocked again and again after another couple of minutes. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Hello." I gasped and quickly whipped around, my heart pounding. The voice belonged to a man. He was tall, but not intimidatingly so, with neatly combed dark brown hair that looked oddly perfect in the midst of the howling wind. He looked at me like I was some kind of intruder. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone laced with annoyance. Still trying to calm down, I replied, "Hi." "No, that's okay, thank you. I'm just waiting for someone to open the door." He gave me a look that made me feel like the stupidest person on earth. "There's no one in there," he said, matter-of-factly. "And nobody here takes well to intruders," so he stepped forward, grabbed my arm, and began pulling me toward my car. "Wait! Wait!" I yanked my arm free and crossed them over my chest. "I'm not an intruder, thank you very much. I'm Sandra, the new Spanish teacher, and I'll be living here for the foreseeable future." A smirk crept onto his face, amusement flickering in his eyes before he burst out laughing. He tried to contain it when he noticed how annoyed I was becoming. I'm sorry, give me a second, okay? "You? The new teacher? You look 12. I shot him a glare. "Not that I need to explain myself to you, but I'm 22, and this is none of your business." He laughed, shaking his head. "Still a baby in my eyes," he said, with an irritating grin. "Slightly older than 12, sure, but a baby." I rolled my eyes, growing more annoyed by the second, especially since he didn't look much older than me. "And how old are you, you wise elder?" 23? I said, sarcasm dripping from my words. His smirk returned, but this time, something darker flickered across his face. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Slightly older than that," he said, his tone unsettling. His words did something to me, made my throat tighten as I suddenly realized how alone I was with this stranger on a deserted street. I shook it off, refusing to let him get to me. "Well, I'd say nice to meet you, and then I hope to see you around, but I'd rather eat glass than do that," I said, trying to regain my composure. "So, if you'll excuse me," I began walking past him toward the house. "There's no one in there," he repeated, his tone suddenly more serious, sending another chill down my spine. I remember thinking I should have worn a thicker jacket. Everyone leaves a light on when they're out, so they don't come home to something they didn't invite in. Everyone knows that. I rolled my eyes again, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. If everyone knows that, doesn't it seem a little counterintuitive? Thieves will just target houses with lights on. Besides, it's not like someone's going to stumble upon this place by accident and rob a house. I could barely find my way here, and I wanted to come. I wasn't talking about people, his voice trailed off ominously. "Anyway, Carmen waited for you for hours, but she had to go home eventually. You'll have to make do until morning. I'd invite you to my house, you know, the neighborly thing to do, but since you'd rather, what was it? Eat glass?" His smirk widened. "I wouldn't want to put you in that predicament. So, enjoy your night in the car. And turn on a light, cars are always free rein." I opened my mouth to respond, but the bark of a dog startled me. When I turned back to him, he was gone, vanished like he'd never been there at all. I sat in the car, huddled under my jacket, laying down in the back seat and contorting my legs so I could find a comfortable position, trying to stay warm as the wind howled around me. The man's words kept reappearing from time to time in my mind as I was trying to calm my racing thoughts enough to get at least a little bit of sleep. I kept trying to tell myself that his words were just small-town nonsense, and that absurd superstitions weren't worth risking running out of battery on my car, but I couldn't shake the creeping sense of dread that threatened to drown me. Damn you, whoever you are. And here I thought sleeping with a nightlight was behind me. I remember thinking. The barking dog had finally stopped, but now an unnerving silence settled over the street, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I flipped on the interior light, hoping it would make me feel less alone, but instead, it just cast strange shadows inside the car, making everything feel more claustrophobic. Out of nowhere, I heard the distinct sound of hooves. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a desperate attempt on the part of my brain to try to lull me to sleep through the exhaustion, but the rhythmic clatter grew louder, unmistakable against the cobblestones. Squinting through the fogged-up windshield, I saw it, a massive black horse standing at the edge of the road. Its eyes glowed in an unnatural amber, and its black hair shimmered in the darkness, as if absorbing the shadows around it. There was something wrong about it, something too still, too perfect, like a statue. I tried to convince myself that that's what it was, but my heart started to race as the horse took slow, deliberate steps toward the car. I wanted to move, to drive away, but I was paralyzed, locked in its gaze. The horse circled the car, its breath coming out in thick, white clouds, fogging the windows even more. Its eyes never left mine, and with each step, the air in the car seemed to grow colder. I could feel it watching me, something far more intelligent and malicious than any animal I'd ever seen before. Suddenly, it stopped right next to my window, towering over the car, and lowered its head. Just as I thought it might smash through the glass, a loud crack echoed through the night, and the horse flinched violently, eyes wide with fear. Its ears pinned back as it reared up, letting out a bone-chilling neigh that pierced through the wind. It bolted into the darkness, hooves pounding the ground, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the empty street, searching for the source of the noise. That's when I saw it, just beyond the trees, a dark shape moving through the shadows, too large to be human, too quick to be anything natural. I spent the rest of the night hugging my knees to my chest, flinching at every sound, every rustle of wind. My mind raced with possibilities, but no explanation seemed to make sense. All I could do was sit there, waiting for dawn to break. When morning finally came, so did Carmen, the woman in whose house I was supposed to be staying. She was short, with graying hair, and she was wearing a long green robe that dragged along the ground as she hurried toward my car. She knocked gently on the window, her face filled with concern. Oh dear, she fretted as I opened the door. Are you all right? I'm so sorry for making you wait out here. When you didn't show up last night, I figured you'd arrive sometime today. Poor thing. All alone out here all night, in your car. I hope it wasn't too terrible. I forced a tired smile. It's all right, Mrs. Walsh. It was my fault. I got lost on the roads. She clucked her tongue. Who in their right mind decides to brave those roads at night? You're a very lucky girl, you know. Even the locals don't travel those paths after dark. Too many have gotten lost and never returned. She made a strange gesture with her hand. No one bothered you, I hope? Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Did she know? Had she heard about the horse, or seen it herself? I couldn't tell if that's what she meant, or if she was just voicing local superstition. Either way, I wasn't about to seem like the crazy new teacher who believed in ghost stories. No, I met someone who told me you'd be back in the morning, so I just waited here. That's all, I said, following her toward the house. She stopped abruptly at that, and I almost bumped into her. When she turned back to look at me, her face was serious. I think I know who you're talking about, she said, her voice low. She took a deep breath before continuing. Child, if there's one thing you listen to me about, let it be this: stay away from Cormac Byrne. Promise me you will. I nodded, even though something told me it was a promise I wouldn't be able to keep. Deep down, I had a feeling I'd be seeing him again. That was 2 weeks ago. I wouldn't be here if I had any other options, but I have nowhere else to go. I'm not a horse person, and I've tried to reach out on horse forums to see if anyone has any advice, but so far, nothing has helped. Because I've seen that horse again. Every night since I moved here, it appears. At first, it was just a distant glow, those same amber eyes shining in the darkness, far off in the distance. But with each passing night, it gets closer. I'm terrified of what will happen when it finally reaches my house. Please, I need urgent advice. I don't think it'll be too long now. Method acting. Female age 20 to 22. Claire, supporting role. Brown/chestnut hair. Fresh out of school. Adventurous personality and a little rough around the edges. Based on that short job listing, I thought Jessica had a good chance of getting the part. When she did, I was delighted. I remember the light in her eyes when she burst into the room to tell me. This meant something to her, more than just a role in a movie. She told me it proved something, not just to her but to her parents. That the years she had spent in college were worth it. This would be something she could be proud of. She's been taking the bus to and from Vancouver since then. The film is being produced by the upcoming film studio, Borderline Pictures. Initially, I was suspicious of the studio. They don't have a website, or almost any information when you look them up online. Neither did the film's Polish director, Yuri Nowak, have any previous work. At least now she can say she's been paid for something in her field, I had thought. Hopefully it'll be easier for her to get more work after this experience, whether or not the film does well. I'm writing this post because of an incident at the studio which occurred yesterday. Before then, I had seen none of her work. I had been excited all week, since Jessica had given me the invitation to tour the studio. She explained it would be a small group, just the crew's close friends and family. The plan was to show us the props department and some of the sets being assembled. It was going to be on a Saturday, which meant no class for me. Even if there was, I would have taken the day off for this. I wasn't going to miss it. This one here, Jessica pointed it out. I pulled my gray car to a stop just outside the grungy warehouse. Its walls had been a tan color, I think, though the paint was stained and peeling. My eyes wandered towards the trash bins outside the entrance. The mound of bulging black garbage bags were wedging the rectangular lid open. Jessica must have noticed as I pursed my lips. I know, she said, it's kind of a sketchy area. We should head inside. Are we a bit early? I asked, craning my neck to get a look at the front entrance. Don't see anyone else going in yet. Yuri should be here, she said. I could tell he was a bit nervous about today. Yeah? I asked, why's that? Just don't want him to think nobody's coming. And, you know that guy I told you about? The guy who lives at the studio? Yeah, she nodded. He sometimes can be a bit unpredictable. I'm sure it'll be fine, I told her. You haven't told me much about him, just that he gets really into character. Some people might be interested to see that even, don't you think? I guess we'll see. Jessica pushed open her door and headed up towards the studio. I followed, giving her what I hoped to be a comforting smile as she pulled the door open. I felt somewhat out of place standing in the front entranceway. Jessica went over to greet the other actors as I lingered at the doorway. There were a few people standing around me. An older couple walked over to introduce themselves. They told me about their grandson who was playing the main role of the protagonist in the film. You must be excited to see the studio as well then, I said. Have you visited it before? Nah, the old man shook his head. He's told us barely anything. Studio secrecy and all that. Right, his wife nodded. Very professional around here, I'd say. I've heard that about these things before. They want to keep everything a mystery. I nodded, turning my focus to the sound of polished shoes approaching from the hallway ahead. His features were stern, but not unfriendly, with an angular jaw. He was extremely thin, and dressed in a baggy gray suit. His mustache was well grown out, but flat as a comb against his lip. Jessica returned to me as a hush fell upon the assembled crowd. "Welcome everyone," said the man, waving. "I'm the director of the film, Yuri Nowak. Glad all of you could make it out. If you follow me, we'll be off to the main stage." He went over some basic rules, that we were not to touch anything and to watch our step when we entered the first set. I will say the interior of the studio was very well kept compared to the exterior. As Yuri led us down the hallway, the tiled floor was extremely smooth. Portions marked with wet floor signs were even noticeably fresh with cleaning solutions. Like they prepared it just for our visit. Through a set of double doors my eyes widened. The set was reminiscent of an old English street. It was built of cobblestone with black lamp posts along the sidewalk. Off to the left-hand side was the exterior of a building, which Yuri referred to as the clock tower. It was enormous, tall enough that it touched the roof. We were told that it was only the bottom half of the tower. The upper half would be added in post. My eyes roamed the space as Yuri talked on. The loose stone shifted beneath my feet as I turned around, taking it all in. I noticed some of the other guests wandering, a few kneeling down to get a closer look at some of the smaller details. Amongst it all, something stuck out to me, seemingly unnoticed by the others. Near the storm grate along the edge of the clock tower was a large stone platform. As I got closer, I could see a wooden trapdoor on its face. As I got closer, I heard something that, I'll admit, sent a shiver through my body. It was a hushed voice which used an aura of excitement. "I've found it," the voice ranted with glee, the voice, the movement. Thank you for showing me. At last, it's all coming together." I was now standing right above the trapdoor. There was a big gold star roughly nailed into the wood. "Excuse me," said the director. Even at a distance I could see the single drop of sweat dripping down his forehead. He approached me at a brisk pace. The trail of guests followed behind. "I was just about to show you all the next room. There's a lot more to see." Just as I stepped back down from the platform, there was a creak as the trapdoor swung open. I caught a glimpse of what seemed to be an ordinary room below. A bed with a white frame. Scattered pages of comic books, and something large and swollen I couldn't quite make out. It was obstructed as the man climbed out, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him. The only skin exposed was the circle of his white face. Head to toe he was dressed in gray with small round blue markers stuck all across it. "Oh, hello," the man glared at me. "You didn't see anything, did you?" He gestured down at the trapdoor. "No." I stammered, shaking my head. The man flashed his teeth as he smiled. "Good. Well, I'm glad to see you all then. I've been locked in my room for I don't know how long. You recognize me, don't you?" His eyes seemed to fix on each of us individually as he waited for an answer. The room remained completely silent. "I'm Andy Baker." "No?" Anyway, for this role they asked me to play a crazy man, a murderer who consumes his victims. All my acting is done in a motion capture suit. It's a CGI character. I argued with them about it for a while. Practical effects would be better, I said, with makeup. Not some modern generated character within a computer. I've put everything into this role. To get into character, I've gone so far as to. Very insightful, Yuri cut in. "Thank you, Andy." Andy scowled. "I told you not to interrupt, remember?" He bit his gray thumb, then pointed it at the director. "Or else I'll do it again." Yuri went pale. "Not here." I flinched as Andy's eyes flashed towards me. Isn't that why you brought all these guests? Why not give them a show? Andy, please, the director gulped. No. Fine then. Fade to black, Andy snarled, clenching his jaw. He then darted away on all fours. Like an animal, he reached the side of the clock tower. We could still see his eyes as he crouched among the rubble. The sound of chewing followed. He does sell the part well, doesn't he? Yuri laughed after a pause. He began to clap. Following his example, the rest of us joined in. I tried to meet Jessica's gaze as I clapped along with the others, but she looked away quickly. You all right? I asked. She held onto my arm tightly as we followed Yuri to the next set of double doors. She looked back towards the clock tower, making sure he was out of earshot before pulling me closer. In a hushed voice, she told me Andy Baker wasn't actually his name. It was his character's name. The Cannibal. Oh, I see. I nodded. What's his real name then? I don't even know. She shook her head. I don't think any of the cast does. He's a serious method actor. At least, that's what Yuri told us the first day. He told us not to ask too many questions, just to go along with it. Leaving the room, Yuri led us down a narrow hallway to what he informed was the motion capture room. It was significantly smaller than the previous space. Above our heads was a ring of cameras facing down into the center of the room. A more friendly-looking actor was introduced who explained how the technology worked. She told us that the tracking markers would be recorded by the cameras above us. This would translate to movement in 3D space and would be a starting point to animate the character. They then showed us some recordings on the monitor at the front of the room and how it looked in the final render. Jessica had explained some of the process to me before, but I thought it was fascinating learning about it in person. The tour ended back at the front entranceway. Well, that about wraps things up, Yuri announced. Once again, I wanted to thank you all for coming out. As for our actors, I need you back on stage C in 5 minutes. Thanks. The director barely paused to wave us off as he headed back the way we'd come. A muttering of chatter erupted all around me as guests began making their way out of the studio. Jessica looked towards me. Are you sure about picking me up after? She asked. It's okay if you want to head back to the apartment. I have my bus pass with me. I was thinking I'd spend the day in Vancouver, explore the city a bit. All right, drive safe then. Jessica gave my hand a squeeze. I'll give you a call when things finish up here. She then hurried off with the other actors, giving me a final wave before disappearing down the hall. Asterisk. I found my car and climbed into the driver's seat. The others began to leave, one by one, until it was just me alone in the parking lot. As I started the ignition, I glanced over at the driver's seat. There was Jessica's phone. How am I supposed to know when to come pick her up if she doesn't have it? I wondered. She must have forgotten it. Stepping out of the car, I returned to the studio. There was a man dressed in black, holding the door open. A puff of smoke hazed in his breath. I could see the fuming cigarette pinched between his fingers. Marching up to the front door, I nodded to the smoker. Thanks, man, I said, heading through the open door. Probably not supposed to be here, I thought. There should be someone who can give this to her, though. A few paces down the hall, I paused. Looking back at the doorway, the smoker at the door was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't far from the main stage now, but I couldn't hear any voices within. The studio itself was eerily quiet. I was very aware of my footsteps after that. The unavoidable wet squeaking as I walked over the wet floor. I approached the large doors of the main stage. They had been left open ajar. All the lights were off, leaving the room black as night. There should be a light switch. I remembered seeing one along the right wall. Stepping through the darkness, I inched towards it. The hinges of the door behind me squealed as they swung shut. The light of the hall faded into a thin sliver across the floor. "Kill him?" a voice asked. "Kill him, you say?" I froze in place. I recognized him immediately. It was between me and the doorway. I held my right arm defensively out towards the voice. My other hand found the wall, and I began searching its surface. The first switch clicked when I pushed it down, but seemed to do nothing. "If you ask, I will," the voice continued. "Lure him down to the depths, and devour." The hairs on the back of my neck bristled as I felt the breath of the last word against my skin. My thumb found another button which I immediately pressed. The lights of the set flashed into luminance. My eyes darted around, taking in the set once more. I was alone on an empty stage. I don't know what it was that made me approach the trapdoor. Curiosity? All I know is that when I saw the lid was open, I couldn't look away. That thing down there, I remembered it from earlier, the gray lump which rested on the edge of the bed. It was coated in crusty grime, fabric stained. What the hell is he keeping down here? I wondered. The rickety ladder creaked as I descended into the room. There was a crunch as my shoes found the wooden floor. Glass, I realized, scattered around me. It had come from a broken mirror laying on its side in the corner. I approached it and found printed photos. Andy, I recognized, smiling in the first image. His eyes looked different, like there was a genuine friendliness there. He was also a bit larger compared to the second photo, which was presumably after he had lost some weight. He looks even thinner now, I thought. I could see the outline of his ribs, even through the motion capture suit. Kneeling, I touched a few of the pieces of glass laying nearby. I picked up a larger shard, shaped like a knife, and took it with me. Finally, I turned my full attention to the bulging bag that had caught my eye to begin with. Moving to the bed, I examined it more closely. It was large with a slimy shine. I reached for the opening, thinking to have a look at whatever was inside. As I tugged at it, a wet glob of fluid began to ooze out. I wasn't able to pull my hand away before I felt it drooling over my fingers. "Yes, I know it has to be raw," I flinched when I heard his voice. I had thought the room was empty. The deer gave them all a fright last time, but getting into character will take more. Raw animal meat hasn't been enough. The floorboards creaked as I stepped around the bed. This hidden lair didn't end with just a bedroom. I spotted a hand railing along the passage, leading deeper. The space below was wide open, a circular room. In the center, I spotted a figure sitting in a large chair. Her wrists were tied to the armrests. Around her foot, a pool of dark fluid gleamed in flickering light. "Jessica," I rushed forward as I realized it was her. I only made it a few steps before the whisper of his voice made me freeze once more. "In servitude I have done it. Are you pleased?" There he was. I could see Andy, sitting at my girlfriend's side. He looked like a rat, perched atop a large metal stool. He was gripping something in his long white fingers. It dripped as he took a bite, staining his knees and trickling to the floor. Jessica didn't react as Andy spoke, dull eyes staring straight ahead. She wore a blank expression. "Am I to wait longer?" Andy asked, "or has the time to devour come?" He was looking past Jessica, to someone else? I wondered. No. If there is, I can't see them. It was faint, though I thought I heard a faint voice respond to him. "We only need her." A shiver ran down my spine. Andy turned his head to stare directly toward me. "The Brotherhood warned me of you," he smiled, "that I might have company during my rehearsal. Do you want to hear more?" "What the hell did you do to her?" I demanded. I noticed there was a saw blade stashed under the actor's shadow. She was in her gray socks. The sawed fabric stuck up oddly around the severed portion. My stomach turned as my mind connected the visuals. He chuckled as he chewed on it. "Is that a no?" Andy raised an eyebrow. "I insist. Come closer, he beckoned me. Let me show you what it is I've been working on. I moved forward, gripping the glass shard behind my back like a blade. I drew it and cut the restraint holding her right arm. Stop it, Andy's smile twitched. I barely managed to pull the rope loose before he lunged at me. His attack was a blur of teeth and nails. I yelled as pain erupted in my neck and shoulder. My arm instinctually landed against his upper chest, pushing off his bloody teeth. I threw him off of me and backed away. He charged once more, diving into me. The air wheezed from my lungs as my back struck the hard floor. My vision blurred. The world was broken into raw shapes as I struggled to regain control. His body was a gray smudge. A white face that gleamed in the eclectic light above. Glass in hand, I drew back my arm then stabbed him. My vision refocused in time to catch the look of agony across the man's face. His eyes clenched shut as it contorted. The glass had embedded in his back, in the soft skin under his left shoulder blade. He howled, stumbling backwards. I took the chance to return to Jessica's side and cut through the second restraint. I grabbed her shoulders and pulled her upright. Go! I told her frantically. She shook her head, blinking slowly at me as if waking from some hex. Her legs wobbled as I nudged her towards the stairs. I followed behind her, putting myself between her and Andy. I could see the trapdoor had remained untouched as we entered the bedroom area. Go, I told Jessica. Grabbing under her arms, I helped lift her up so she could crawl through the exit. The crunching of rubble followed as she disappeared from view. I flinched as there came an ear-piercing scream somewhere above, not from Jessica. I grabbed hold of the ladder. Andy appeared at the stairwell as I began to climb. There was fury in his eyes. He charged me. Get away, I shouted. His fingernails were like thorns as they bit into my lower leg. I kicked at him and my foot found his jaw. He fell back, giving me enough time to clamber up the rest of the ladder. I emerged onto the set and found myself under the gaze of several stage lights. I blinked, covering my brow, as faces from the edges of the set watched in confusion. Jessica, I rushed to her side. All eyes were on her and her bloody foot. A small pool had already formed, leaking between her fingers that were clamped around it. Her face was contorted in a silent scream. I need to get her out of here, I thought. I pulled her upright, supporting her weight as we hobbled to the doors. Looks of terror were plastered on the faces of the film crew as we passed them by. She left midway through the second half of the shoot, the director stammered. He moved into our path. Everyone was looking for her. And then when we couldn't find Andy as well. Out of the way, I pushed past Yuri as we turned down the hallway. Jessica had been mumbling since I'd gotten her out of that chair. Whatever trance she had been under had only partially faded. She reacted as if there were demons in the walls, flinching frequently and holding tight to me. It only got worse as we stepped out into the parking lot. We're not going to make it, she screamed, burying her face in my arm. We will, I told her, looking around for the unseen horror. There's nothing following us, we're gonna get you help. I pulled open the car door then gently helped Jessica sit. The wound on her foot looked uneven from the saw blade. The entire foot was drenched in blood. I took off my shirt and wrapped it around the wound in a tight knot. I could see the stumps of the missing toes wiggling beneath the fabric as red stains formed. She seemed to have calmed a bit as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. She was breathing heavily in and out through her nose. It was difficult for me to see that pain in her eyes as her skin continued to quiver. I pulled out of the parking lot and out through the front gate. Speeding down the road, I wanted to put as much distance between us and the studio as possible. Asterisk. Writing this all out has been therapeutic to me. Still processing everything that's happened, and questioning. Of course I stayed with her overnight at the hospital. Since we've left the studio I've felt a presence hanging over us. It's been strong enough that I haven't dared sleep. I'm exhausted. The main question in my mind is, what is this presence? Andy? Or whatever he was speaking to down in the cellar. Jessica's hysteria continued on when we first arrived. "They're following," she cried as her eyes darted around wildly. Not my friends, couldn't stop them. The nurses hushed her as they led us to a private room to care for her injured foot. The doctors asked me if she had a history of hallucinations. I don't think that's true, that it's all in her head. At one point last night she woke up suddenly. "They won't stop," she said softly, "the voices." "What are they saying?" I was startled by the look in her eyes. Something about them seemed different. It wasn't terror anymore. More like hunger. "This voice, it's so faint," she whispered as she stared at me. Once more, I peered deep into her eyes, searching. They had an unfamiliar dullness to them. Gray streaks around the edges. "I can't make out the words yet," she told me, "but I can't help but listen." The summer house. It was the kind of summer people dream of, long and hot, with endless days spent in our beautiful family cottage in the English countryside. The air was filled with laughter, the clink of wine glasses, and the warmth of the sun on our skin. My young daughter played happily, running in the gardens while the rest of our extended family lounged on the patio. It felt perfect, idyllic. But something in the house began to change. My daughter spent more and more time in the old playroom, spinning stories about a witch. At first, it seemed harmless, just part of her imagination. But soon, her behavior shifted, small things at first, like odd silences or the way she looked at me with unfamiliar eyes. Shadows in the house seemed to move, objects were out of place, and the air felt different. My teenage nephew became obsessed, convinced she was no longer herself, but possessed by an evil spirit. I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease every time I looked at her. My daughter, once so innocent and full of joy, had changed. Her voice carried a strange edge, and I began to feel something dark in her presence. The more time I spent in the house, the more I believed it. My nephew insisted the spirit was that of an old witch, and the rest of the family, terrified, kept their distance. My fear of her grew, but so did my desperation to save her. In our frantic attempts to rid her of this evil, we performed rituals, useless, desperate things we convinced ourselves would work. We whispered to each other late into the night, sure we saw signs of the witch's presence, spiraling deeper into our own madness. We became obsessed with driving the spirit out, our fear feeding off each other, until we could hardly tell what was real. When her father arrived, he found us in a frenzy. We tried to convince him that something evil had taken hold of our daughter, that we had seen things no one could explain. But he was rational, searching the house for an answer. What he found was worse than any witch, a carbon monoxide leak. The gas had been slowly poisoning us, twisting our minds, making us believe the impossible. He ordered us to leave immediately, but I was reluctant, still trapped in my belief that the danger was real. As the fresh air cleared our lungs, reality began to set in. There had been no witch, no possession, just the gas poisoning us, distorting our senses and driving us into madness. But the damage was already done. My daughter, now silent and wide-eyed, was forever changed. She had seen her own family turn against her, torment her in our delusion. As we drove away from the cottage, the car was filled with a suffocating silence. My daughter sat in the back seat, traumatized by what we had done, and no amount of truth could undo it. Thanks for taking the time to read. This was a very strangely vivid nightmare that I had last night, so I decided to write it up in my dream journal this morning and then decided to share it. Polaroid Man. I didn't understand the object Freddy shook in my face or why he was so excited. Halloween night in '87 wasn't as illuminated as today. "It's a picture," he yelled, and spat into my face. "Look! Look!" I put my pillowcase down and held his wrist gently to see the fuss, a Polaroid picture with Freddy in his sad pirate costume. When I looked more closely, however, I saw the singed boy beneath. Polaroid Freddy looked burnt to a crisp. His skin gone. The eyes melted away. Freddy snapped the picture from my fingers. "Isn't it cool?" He studied it again. "Like a magic trick." Best Halloween ever. Right? It's cool, right? He continued to bully me for validation, as 10-year-old boys do, until I relented. It's cool, Freddy. Where did you get it? You know Mr. Malcolm's house? Super green lawn guy? Tells dirty jokes to us at the bus stop? The weirdo pervert? That guy? Freddy nodded enthusiastically, missing my intended sarcasm. Everyone usually avoided Mr. Malcolm's house on Halloween and every other day. The man constantly invited kids inside for candy and conversation. I don't know if anyone accepted that offer. I hope not. Yeah, Freddy confirmed, but there's a young guy on the porch. Probably his nephew or something. He's got on a mega spooky demon mask, and he's got a camera, and he takes your picture, and it prints out all freaky like mine and Dash. Whoa, Freddy, I said. He was getting overexcited. Freddy had something wrong with him. A weak heart maybe, though I can't recall exactly what we were told other than he could die should he get too worked up. Our teachers told us to look out for Freddy. So I did. It's great. Calm down. I started breathing with him and held his hand. He smiled. Thanks, man. Wanna see? I smiled back. Yup. The photo had creeped me out, but also fascinated me. I didn't want to be the only kid who missed out on something cool. Judging by the line extending down the walkway, bending at a right angle onto the sidewalk, it seemed I might. There had to be 50 kids waiting for their photo. Polaroid pictures aren't fast. They don't present an image until at least 10 minutes have gone by. The guy on the porch wore a thin mask with horns that really seemed to grow from his forehead. A mouthpiece displayed jagged teeth. He carefully placed the undeveloped photo on a shoe rack at his side. You don't shake Polaroid pictures. You wait. And so we waited. He could have simply given the white rectangles to the eager kids before the image showed, but he didn't. Instead, after taking a trick-or-treater's photo, he sat cross-legged on Mr. Malcolm's concrete slab of a porch and stared at the child. Some kids tried to talk with him. He didn't answer. Others waited in silence, bearing the stranger's gaze with admirable defiance. One little boy began to cry. His parents ushered him away before he could collect his photo. I remember thinking how fortunate I was that my parents let me trick or treat on my own. I would get my photo. I would endure the awkwardness of the adult gaze. Time ticked on. It was late. Some kids gave up and left the line, to my delight. Freddy yawned and said he had to go. I thanked him for telling me about the Polaroid man. I probably wouldn't have come down Ferry Street otherwise. Mr. Malcolm creeped me out too much. Luckily, a few other school friends were revealed by the departures, May DeFranco and Vicky Rand. They'd already gotten their photos, but hung around because May's little sister wanted one too. Can I see? I asked, pointing at the photos. They were grotesque, and I could hardly bear it. May's body appeared popped open, entrails spilling from her guts and onto splintered remnants of bone and muscle. Only the pink princess dress she wore as her costume identified her as the corpse in the photo. Vicky's was far worse. Her dead body had been tied at the wrists and ankles. Her pale face appeared stunned at the mutilation of her body. The top half had been pulled apart from the bottom, and there were more tortured dead around her in a dark field. Cool, right? Vicky said. It's like Freddy Krueger or something. You've never seen Freddy Krueger, May said. I hadn't seen A Nightmare on Elm Street either. I never have. At the time, I assumed the contents of the photo were typical horror movie stuff. I wasn't ready for it, but I wouldn't let my discomfort show. After May's sister got her photo, more kids thought better of risking their worried parents' wrath. They left, and after one more boy got his photo, my turn came at 11:42 p.m. My parents were probably pissed off by 8. So I figured, wrongly, I wouldn't be in more trouble for continuing to stay out way past the time I should have been home. Though I did have second thoughts, especially when I realized no other kids remained. I would be the last, and I was alone with the devil-masked man. "Don't smile," he growled. I adjusted my face quickly to obey. He snapped the picture and sat on the stoop. We waited. The last leaves on the trees hissed a warning in the wind. Their dead brethren skittered away down Ferry Street. I could hardly breathe as he stared. There were no visible eyes in the sockets of his mask, only oily voids, an unfortunate trick of the dim porch bulb. It had to be. The feeling in my stomach called for a quick escape. "I think I need to go," I told him. His hand gripped my wrist hard. I squirmed. "It's okay. I can pick it up tomorrow." He did not let go. His face, that mask, got close to mine. He was perfectly quiet. No inhalation or exhale as he forced me to stay put. "Please," I begged, "I want to go home." In the half-inch space between our noses, he slid the developing Polaroid. This close, I could barely see anything. Then the devil's mask appeared in the photo. Then I, or what would become of me, materialized. The Polaroid featured us together, his hands around my neck, my face empty of life. I yelped and pulled away. He let go, and I fell onto the walkway. He stood up and tossed the photo with precision. It landed beside me on the grass. Further details of the horror were revealed. A swath of blood matted my hair and soaked the front of my costume like a gory bib. The man in the devil mask had done more than strangle me according to the image. I backed away, a reverse crab walk of cumbersome doom. He hadn't moved because he could catch me any time he liked. His first step knocked his camera off the stoop. It clattered, and a piece shot away from the impact. He didn't seem to care. Please," I pleaded with him. I don't remember the specifics of how I got up and ran down the middle of Ferry Street. I only recall the chase was brief because I made a mistake and got cornered in the variety store parking lot. The store, Brothers Variety, had been closed for hours. There'd be no help there. The streets were empty. Most people were asleep. How I knew this or thought about it in such a terrible moment came down to dumb luck. I backed into a pile of leaves bunched up with fake spider webs that had blown off someone's house. Stuck, I raised my arms defensively and caught the time on my digital watch, the wrong side of midnight by 12 minutes. His fingers caressed the sides of my neck. I closed my eyes and started trembling uncontrollably. Pain would be next. Great pain. The photo promise. And death. No. I tried to shout, but it came out like a squeak. Halloween is over. It's over. It's done. You can't. I don't know what I was saying or why. But the fingers retreated, and he took noiseless steps backwards over the cracked tarmac. When he reached the sidewalk, he spoke. "See you next year, then." As if it had been a prank all along, he walked away, casually. It took far too long for me to go the opposite way. Eventually, I managed a slow jog, working through the blocks to home, where my mom waited in the front window, worried and angry. Punishment was left up to my father. When he returned from searching for me, I told him about the photo and the guy in the mask. He received the information passively before grabbing his baseball bat and calling his brothers. Together, they went to Mr. Malcolm's and discovered the busted door in the backyard. The old man had died in his chair, completely naked, My dad told me this last detail some years later. Police were called, but nothing came of whatever investigation might have followed. My parents had, and have, no faith in the Bridal Veil Lake PD. Hence the reason he called his brothers and picked up his bat that night. Evidence of the devil-masked man existed, of course. Many kids had their photos taken. No police or adults asked about it, as far as I know. Mine had been left on Mr. Malcolm's lawn. But Freddie, May, and Vicky said they still had theirs at home. Freddie's, however, likely burned up in the fire the following Christmas. His dad made the mistake of using a space heater in the garage. All of them, including Freddie, were dead the day before Christmas Eve. I refused to go trick-or-treating the next year, and everyone after that. My parents understood and didn't pressure me. Within a few years, I aged out of the tradition, but still wouldn't risk going out for a walk on Halloween night. See you next year then. And, if not, the next, or the next, or the next. He waits. I know, because every photo has turned out to be true. Vicky simply disappeared before her 19th birthday, and while her body was never recovered, a man suspected of torturing and killing half a dozen young women in Bridal Veil Lake and Derry, across the border, was arrested as the likely culprit. May committed suicide off the old casino hotel last July. My son is 5 now. He wants me to take him trick-or-treating in a few weeks. Of course, he does. He doesn't know. Neither does my wife. That man is waiting for me. Sir. I won't bore you with the drivel I'm sure you'd expect of a doomed woman. I've made peace with it, and I urge you to not attempt changing my mind. I first encountered it at the mall, in the food court, with my friend, Jesse. There wasn't much irregular about the day. We had a habit of meeting, provided we were free, at the mall on Saturdays. We had just finished some routine shopping and Jesse insisted that we ordered something to eat before we left. When I told them that I didn't have money to be spending on food, they shook their head and said that they would pay for it. We approached the desk of an outlet which seemed to have moved in within the previous week, as neither of us recalled seeing it the Saturday previous. Above the outlet glowed a neon yellow sign which read Esser, and behind an off-white counter there was a short, disturbingly skeletal man who tapped the countertop in an offbeat pattern. Behind him, the walls and floors appeared stained, but Jesse insisted we ordered food there, citing their admittedly appeasing menu and Jesse's love for Indian food. Despite my own sanitary concerns and the unease the emaciated man inspired in me at the idea that maybe, just maybe, we may not be so different, I agreed. I rarely have 2 meals a day, if one. Yet I insist to all who make my acquaintance that I am quite chubby, no matter if a scale would disagree. I do not leave my house unless in the company of the few friends I have, as when I am alone I become hopelessly frightened and get myself into frequent embarrassment. So when Jesse finished their order, then informed me that they would not order for me as well, I stared at them scornfully and shook my head. They pushed it no further, and to their credit, they did not know about my aversion to eating as far as I am aware. They did know, however, that I was deathly afraid of talking to people in even marginally pressured environments such as at a fast food joint. The man had seemed friendly enough though, his eyes lit up and he smiled widely at Jesse when they ordered. Yet I thought of it as a minor victory, as I had a viable excuse to why I was not going to eat. I was planning to pick at the food while Jesse ate, then carry it home and toss it in the fridge. I would eat it eventually, of course, the very next day. I was above wasting my friend's money, but I had already eaten before I came. I think I did at least. We waited for the man to give us a receipt, but he just walked into the back and came out with a styrofoam box and a bag and my friend's Coke. He thanked us ecstatically for ordering, wished us a good day, then walked out from behind the desk and disappeared into the business of the mall. I exchanged a strange look with Jesse, but we just chuckled and shrugged it off. Jesse and I didn't linger longer at the mall after that. Neither of us particularly liked the noise of conversation. Jesse tolerated it better than I did, so we got into my car. Jesse ate while I ventured to return them to their apartment. They made strange comments about the food. They said that the food was extremely warm, as if the man had just cooked it when he handed it over, and that it tasted unbelievably good for a place that we had never heard of. After they finished dancing their fork from the food into their mouth, they muttered that they felt heavy but not fulfilled. I arrived at their apartment complex soon after, and they hugged me and wished me home safely. Before they walked off, though, they said that they needed me to visit on Wednesday night. They had something to give me. I nodded, told them I would be there, and drove home, thinking nothing of the day. The apartment complex in which Jesse lived was scarcely maintained, and the hallways which connected the various rooms together had an air of decay about them. The ceiling panels were fallen or hanging in various areas, the walls were moist where the tenants within could afford air conditioning, and there was an old, pervasive, dusty smell present within each suite, or at least I assumed so. Jesse never was able to rid themselves of it. When Jesse opened the door to let me on Wednesday, it seemed the necrotic aspect of the building spread even to them. Their eyes lacked the brightness I knew of them, instead seeming to be quite sunken and sleepy. Jesse stood with the door half open, not quite inviting me to enter. "Is everything okay?" A frown tugged at the corner of my lips. I thought Jesse had to be ill. I then perhaps rudely forced my way into their apartment. I wanted to ensure that Jesse was taking care of himself. However, after I pushed the door open, I noticed that my friend's arms seemed to be held behind their back, but then noticed that they simply lacked the appendage. I stared at them for a few seconds and tears welled in their eyes. They seemed like they were about to cry, so I guided them towards their couch and allowed them to do so. They broke down, sobbing about hunger. They held their hands on their forehead and made no effort to wipe their eyes or nose as they precipitated. I told them I understood their woes, by misfortune of my own condition, and that even if they felt themselves to have gained what they considered to be an unacceptable amount of weight, it would simply not do to starve. "Jess, look in the mirror. You look wired. Your lips are cracked." I lowered my gaze to their torso, and it seemed that either they had lost more weight than I would have imagined was possible in such a time frame, or they had gone out of their way to wear a shirt that was several sizes too big. Yet, my mind returned to Jesse's lost extremity. "What the hell happened? To your arm, I mean. You don't get it. You won't get it. I dash." "What?" Jesse grabbed my wrist with their remaining arm. "You need to eat, Emily. Promise me you'll eat." "What are you going on about?" "I don't understand. You ate your arm?" "No. I didn't eat my goddamn dash," they chuckled grimly. "I said you wouldn't understand." "He ate it." "The yeser, he said that if I just give in, if I just eat, then he'll make it quick. He'll make the first bite end it all before he eats me whole, and then I won't know this void anymore. Promise me you'll eat, and make it quick." Once it takes hold, nothing feels like it has any weight anymore. I just nodded and sat awkwardly, gently pulling my arm from their grasp. They smiled at me and got up. They retrieved a sheaf of 2 papers from their kitchen counter, written on which was an annotated copy of The Conqueror Worm by Edgar Allan Poe. I had begged Jesse in months past to read the poem, which I intended to joke about, and honestly thought it had slipped their mind. "I was hoping to give you this with higher spirits, you know, as a token of friendship." They smiled wistfully. "Remember me?" I didn't know how to feel as I drove home. Neither did I when I sat at my table and ate a proper meal to fulfill my friend's strange last request. Afterwards, I went to sleep, naively hoping that when I awoke, it would be revealed that the day was nothing more than a dream or a well-executed joke. When I awoke, there was a man standing in the corner of my room, the same man, I realized, who stood behind the register at Esser. He looked mournful, yet noticeably less skeletal than when I'd seen him at the mall. He told me that he was the Lord of the Flies. He told me that he was sorry for what had to happen, but everything had to eat, and he had no other choice than to come to reap my lackluster mass due to my association with Jesse. Then, he got up and ran straight through my window, breaking it. I knew better than to doubt my sobriety, and I knew, failing insanity, that this entity was real. I fell into a deep depression for the next day or so. I didn't eat. I didn't call any of the few other friends I had. I merely lay on my bed, showered, and went on my phone. I wondered if I was failing Jesse by not doing as they asked, and though it seemed pointless, I made an effort to make myself a rather large sandwich. I sank my teeth into the fiber of the sandwich and felt the slimy bolus slide down my throat and into my stomach. I still felt guilty, but I consider promises sacred, and I would feel much guiltier betraying one I made. When I woke up the next day, my hand was gone. There was a grievous wound which was haphazardly stitched shut, and caused me to gag as I looked on the raw flesh. I think, through a lucky delusion, I deduced correctly that it was missing due to my eating. The sandwich probably weighed as much as my hand did. I tended to blame things unreasonably on my eating though, as I've been told. That day, due to said delusion, I refused to eat. That night, I was watching a TV show on my laptop, sat on my couch, when I felt its presence next to me. It didn't seem hostile, merely sitting next to me, and in fact, it disarmed me when I noticed that it was watching my laptop as I was. However, its stomach growled constantly, every few seconds, and it fidgeted as if in withdrawal. "Aren't you hungry?" it asked. Its voices were soft and numerous, like a wave of cotton blanketing me. I blinked at it and looked into what passed as its eyes. I saw in its eyes not quite the worry which I had become familiar with getting from friends and family, but rather a hint of fear, maybe even desperation. I recalled what Jesse had said to me the last time I had seen them, and stated my assumption. "If I eat, you'll be able to take my flesh. Are you hungry?" I wasn't quite sure if it was true, but I could find reason to believe it. My friend had said that it had eaten their arm, and it wanted them to continue eating in exchange for making their death fast. Why else would this thing care about our eating habits? Still, I wasn't sure if the Esser would still be able to harm me if I angered it, so after saying that to it, I got up and locked myself in the bathroom. It made no move to enter or try to break the door, and when I got out, it was still sitting there on the couch. A week passed, and I refused to partake in food. I felt a rope wrap around my gut and pull tightly, yet it was nothing new. I saw my lips crack as my salivary glands became swollen, my face became sunken, and my skin stretches taut and clings to my ribs like cling wrap. My limbs are but bones blanketed solely with skin, and are rigid. I feel exhausted, and the sun burns my eyes, which have taken on a similar quality to my late friends, yet lacking the sense of hopelessness I'd seen in them. My body discards the contemptible fat which haunted me ever throughout my life, and I can no longer find it within me to push my reservations aside and shovel weight into my maw. I will not bloat my body, stain my purity, in the pursuit of some socially defined idea of health. I know that now, just for the rest of the time I bide, I can do so without guilt. Yet what truly convinced me to take the creature with me is that if I did so, I would die happy. My stomach goes in. If anything, as ashamed as I am to admit, this creature has blessed me with a pristine death. It begged me to eat one night, asked me if I didn't feel the gnawing at my insides, a feeling which I am all too used to. This is no way to go, it told me. There is no dignity in this. Give in, I will make it quick. Eat enough to provide me access to your entire mass, and the first thing I will do is rip your jugular out. You will not awake. All I heard were the doomed pleas of an eternal entity consigned to a shared coffin. I figured out after a day that even as I drank calories, the weight was stripped of me. I drank a can of beer the day after, and woke up to find several of my fingers on my remaining hand ripped off crudely, and the bones barely attached to my hands stilled by scarce strings of sinew. This was less ideal. Dehydration is a discomfort which still pains me, but it seems that the quantity the Lord of Stench is able to strip from me was equivalent not to weight but to calories. Water would gain me nor lose me no mass. It's been a week since. I feel the hunger pangs periodically, but I've since turned to less healthy methods to stave off the feeling. Not that my health is of any consequence of me now. As I look at my own image in the mirror and find that I am so skinny I rot from view, just as I've wanted, I see its wretched form rot when it begs me to give in to the whaler's grievance of guilty consumption. I have probably half a week left until my body can no longer find the energy to keep its shriveled mass afloat, but so does the creature, and from this I feel a sick, avenged satisfaction. There are things in the woods we were never meant to find. I have seen them. There's something I need to get off of my chest. A decade-old memory. One that's always scratching at the back of my mind, like the twisted branches of a dead tree. It's a tale so harrowing that I've never told anyone about it. This story is set in a distant, desolate place called the Weeping Woods. You'll first need to understand why I was in that unspeakable place, so far from proper civilization, with 3 of my friends. We were social science students, all 4 of us. Obsessed with culture, history, myth, religion, the works. We were looking to take on an honors research project, and naturally, we wanted it to be something big, something original. It was Jack, my closest friend, who suggested it. He was from Pennsylvania originally, specifically a town some 50 miles from the forest. He told us about the Weeping Woods. He told us about the Woodwick Walker. Of the 4 of us, Tina was the folklore junkie, so naturally she snapped at the suggestion. Come on, guys, she insisted, we get to do a road trip, camping, and our project all in one. And I bet good money that none of the other groups are going to research anything as creepy or as intriguing as what Jack just told us about. I couldn't argue with that, and I had no better suggestion. Marcus, our other friend, wasn't as eager. Spooky stuff really wasn't his thing. But he saw the rest of us agreeing and sighed, all right. Fine. So we packed Jack's truck with everything we'd need to drive out of state for up to 2 weeks. Luckily for us, his Silverado was built like a goddamn dump truck. It could fit the 4 of us, all our clothes, food, additional supplies, and, most importantly, our recording equipment. Jack and I took turns driving, so the trek all the way up to Pennsylvania went by quick enough. We only stopped if we needed gas or the bathroom. Along the way, Jack told us more about the legend. The Weeping Woods are named as they are supposedly because those who escaped them were always in tears. According to who? I asked. Jack shrugged. That's just a legend. As unlikely as it sounds, the tale took hold enough that no one from my town liked to go there. He nudged his head at the rearview mirror. The reason we brought the saws and towing cables are in case the road is stopped up. The dingy old track that leads to the woods is used so little that it often ends up blocked by fallen trees. Marcus's breath hissed through his teeth. We had to choose the scariest, most backwater place in the world, didn't we? Hell yes, Tina replied. You're damn right we did. So, I asked, why were people crying? I guess it had to do with the Woodwick Walker. Sort of, Jack said. They were crying because they'd been forced to leave people behind. When asked about what had happened, they'd always have a hard time talking about it. A few gave vague descriptions of a man in the woods who was part of the forest. "Oh," Tina sighed, "I love this shit. Please, go on." Jack nodded. The one bit of info that solidified over the decades as the rule of the woods is this: do not look at his face. If, when you encounter him, do not look up. His voice grew stiff as he explained. Close your eyes. If you can't do that, then stare at your feet. Nothing else. Jack, Marcus murmured, you got awfully serious just now. Jack cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the road. Did I? You definitely did, I agreed. Sorry. I still bug out over it a little, even all these years later. Have you been to the Weeping Woods? I asked him. I've only been to their edge. To tell you the truth, this legend scared the living shit out of me as a kid. The area around the house I grew up in was forested, too, and I'd always imagined seeing him between the trees. I lifted an eyebrow. If you're damn well traumatized by this thing, why'd you suggest it for the project? The only way to overcome a fear is to face it, he said. True enough, Tina agreed. I have to admit, the way Jack talked about it during that ride got to me. Even Tina was a little more reverent about it all after that. And Marcus was so spooked we were worried he'd jump ship and hitchhike back south. But the four of us pressed on. The road meandered, rose, and fell until eventually the rainy, autumnal woodland of Pennsylvania appeared on the horizon. It was late autumn, so the pretty colors had given way for the most part to barren trees with only a smattering of rusty brown leaves left on them. We drove through Jackstown, which in itself was so backwoods that it was hard to imagine any place more far-flung. There was one diner in the whole of the place, a local spot offering breakfast on the overcast morning we arrived. We knew we'd be living off our camp food for the next while, so we popped in there. When we told the friendly waitress what we were up to, she stopped being nearly as nice. You kids promised me one thing, she said in low tones. You keep your eyes to the ground in them woods. We laughed a little at that. She didn't. I finished my food quickly, eager to get out of there. As we walked back to the truck, Jack said, See? It's a whole thing out here. And you thought this was a good idea? Marcus groaned. Relax, guys, Jack went on. It's just a legend. A story. Tina said, we should stop by here again when we're done camping. A recorded interview with that waitress, or any other locals who might have something to say, would be great for the project. Hell, I said, we ought to record an interview with Jack. He's got plenty to say, too. Yeah, Jack sighed as he thumped his door shut. Get in. We're losing daylight. Just how far do we have to go? I asked. 20, maybe 30 miles, Jack explained. No one actually knows how far the Weeping Woods are. The road there is kinda what? Marcus prodded. It's kinda weird. You'll see. He wasn't kidding. Even the turn onto the road was decrepit. The pavement of the highway gave way to mulchy dirt, so littered with branches and fallen leaves that only Jack's trained eye could have spotted it. The road itself was derelict, a vestige of some bygone era. The way it veered and twisted was illogical. Oftentimes we felt like we were turned all the way around and going back towards the highway. And the whole way, the only real indication that we were still on the road was the tall, gnarled trees lining the track. After a few minutes of winding through, I pointed at the compass on the Silverado's dashboard display. We've turned this way and that, yet the compass has read northwest the whole time. Jack gave a tentative nod. The road leads northwest into the Weeping Woods. No matter what. Tina said, that doesn't make any sense. I told you it'd be weird, didn't I? Jack had an edge of irritability to him now, in his voice, in the knit of his brow. You good, bro? I gently said. Sorry, he sighed. My bad, guys. This road gives me the creeps, is all. I'll chill. It was just then that we rounded a dense thicket of trees and saw a massive fallen log blocking the road. Perfect, Marcus groaned. Jack cursed under his breath, his eyes darting left and right, peering through the trees. I raised my hands. Hey now. We've got the tools to deal with this. No biggie. I'll take care of it. Tina shuffled about before raising her DSLR camera. Marcus and I will take a few pictures while you deal with it. And maybe a video or two. She rolled down our window. Sounds good. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my door, and jumped out. The ground I fell onto would have been soft and inviting if not for the thick tree root that jabbed into the sole of my foot. As Jack clicked the ignition and shut the Silverado's engine down, the first thing I noticed in the chilly autumn evening was the silence. A deep, encompassing quiet lay over the road, broken only by the hissing of the wind as it bothered the dark leaves that had yet to fall. Damn, I whispered to myself, not entirely certain why I felt the need to keep my voice down. A dense fog had descended on the woodland, I suppose that was dampening the forest sounds. As I walked to the back of the truck, Jack stepped out and joined me. I told him, I don't mind handling this on my own, you know. He shook his head. Nah. I'll help you. It's all good. I nodded, though with how shifty he was being, I almost wished he'd have just stayed in the damn truck. In any case, we grabbed a couple saws and walked over to the log. It was the corpse of a huge tree, and several of its thickest limbs were tangled with other still living trees at the edge of the road. I gestured toward those limbs, then looked at Jack. What do you think? Yeah. We saw off the big arms. The jammed ones. Then we tow the log once it's loose. Nodding, I got started. Both Jack and I went hard. The sky was dimming, though it wasn't even late into the afternoon. The grinding and zipping of our saws seemed to violate the serenity of the forest, its near-perfect silence spoiled by the sounds of men. It was awfully uncomfortable, both because of the disturbance, and because getting through those limbs was a ton of work. We should have brought a friggin' chainsaw, I chuckled. Heh, Jack murmured in reply. It's weird, I called over the scraping of our saws, the way it feels like it's almost evening. It's overcast today, but feels like it's too dim. Yeah. That happens. Nothing unusual. Motion at the periphery of my vision turned me around before Jack had finished his sentence. I saw a pale limb, a ropey leg, vanish behind a tree. What? Jack asked. I looked at him. I saw something. Look. I turned around, pointing, and saw that the pale leg I'd seen was just the twisted trunk of a stubby tree. It hadn't vanished behind the tree, it was still there, curling away and out of sight. Hell, it didn't even look all that much like a leg. I turned back to Jack. I'm an idiot, I said with a grin. It's nothing. It's hard to see through the fog. My mind is messing with me. Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the forest beyond me. You're sure? He asked. Yeah, bro. It's nothing. I got back to sawing. Another 15 minutes droned by before we felt the tree was dislodged enough to be towed. We hooked up the towing line and revved the engine, pulled the dead tree by one end until it was out of the way. One SEC, Jack said as he hopped back out to reel in the towing cable. It's dark, Tina pointed out. Too dark. I craned my neck down to peer past the truck's ceiling and over the treetops. The gray sky looked like what I'd expect at 7 or 8 p.m., though a glance at the dash display revealed the time to be just 1 p.m. Yeah, I muttered. Jack wasn't kidding. This place is weird. It's not too late to turn back, Marcus begged. We can pick something else and start fresh. No, Tina snapped. We've already put way too much into this. Besides, the weirder the better, right? I recorded a bit while you guys were out, explaining the situation. She lowered her voice. I talked a little about Jack's behavior, too. I turned to glare at her. Really? Of course, she said. This little psychological quandary of his may well make for this project's best anecdotes. She wasn't wrong about that. Still, it felt wrong to turn our friend into a case study without him knowing. I don't like it, said Marcus. You don't like any of this, Tina drawled. It's fine. Jack climbed back into the truck, having coiled and stowed the towing cable. Finally. Let's get going. He tossed the Silverado into gear and we set off. The dead and mauled log that had obstructed our path floated past my side of the truck as we went. Beyond, I thought I saw another pale limb retreat behind a tree. This time I knew better than to dwell on a figment of my imagination. The road seemed to narrow as we delved farther. To be more specific, it felt as though the twisting trees flanking it leaned in more. We saw less of the sky as branches from either side of the track mingled overhead. With each turn, the fog thickened and the daylight faded. At least the road's staying clear, I said to the others as Jack flipped on the headlights. By then I couldn't even see past the closest line of tree trunks, and honestly, I was glad. Keeping my eyes set steady on the road ahead was simpler. More calming. There's a little more to the legend, Jack said after some time. The rest of us looked at him. The victims of the walker, he explained, they're said to remain bound to the weeping woods. They're spirits. He glanced at the rear view, probably meeting Tina and Marcus's eyes. Some claim they've seen those spirits. Trying to leave the woods, but never able to get far. They're trapped, Tina remarked. Unable to move on to an afterlife. Something like that, replied Jack. The four of us had little else to say the rest of the way. The constant rumble of the Silverado coupled with the deepening dark lulled us into a stupor. It was 2:45 p.m. when we reached the end of the road. As the truck pulled into the small clearing, I started. Holy shit. There's a car. Jack looked over to my side of the truck. I heard the other two shuffling as they straightened to look, too. Oh God, Marcus whispered. How common is that? Asked Tina. Jack cleared his throat. Not very. Still though, there's a legend surrounding this place. We aren't the only intrepid folk to brave the weeping woods. I peered into the car, it seemed empty. Probably just someone exploring like we are. Yeah, Jack agreed. So, Tina said, this is it, then. Yeah, answered Jack. Past that tree lean. That's the weeping woods. Looks the same as the rest of these woods, I pointed out. It's not, Jack replied. Come on. The sooner we make camp, the sooner we can relax. He swung his door open and stepped out. Fuck me in the ass, Marcus groaned as he kicked his door open. Let's get it over with. He jumped out. Tina and I followed suit. As the others unloaded the truck, I walked over to the derelict car. It was an old Toyota, rusted all along its frame, with so much grime over its windows that it was tough to see through. There was no way that someone had been driving behind that dirty windshield. This thing had been here for a while. I placed the bottom of my palm on the window and rubbed away as much of the grime as I could. Then I lowered myself and peered inside. There wasn't anything unusual in there. Some junk on the passenger side floor. A travel mug in the cup holder. A tote bag in the back. The only thing that caught my attention was a slip of paper on the dash. I rounded the hood until I was standing over that bit of the windshield. I spat on the glass and wiped again. The slip of paper had bold handwriting in all caps that read, "Gonna look. I have to. Tell Lorena it was a crash." I backed away from the hood. The trees hissed as a gust of wind swept through the clearing. "Guys," I called. They walked over. "What is it?" Tina asked. "Read this." I waited for them each to take a look. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. Tina asked Jack, "Have people been known to come here to commit suicide? You know, like Aokigahara Forest in Japan." Jack shook his head. "No. Not that I know of." "This person seriously did not come back," Marcus said. "He could have gotten lost?" I offered. We all looked at Jack. He shrugged. Marcus threw up his hands. "At what point do we concede that this forest is actually dangerous?" "You're an academic, Mark," Tina said. "Do you really believe the Woodwick Walker is real?" "I'm not saying that," he spat back. "But legends arise for a reason, don't they? In this case, I'd argue that reason was to justify the dangers of this cursed place." Tina scowled to herself. Then she looked at me. "How are you feeling about all of this?" I looked from her to Marcus. "I'm more curious than scared at this point." "Sorry, Mark." Tina looked at Jack. "And you?" "I want to see this through." She looked back to Marcus. "Well?" Marcus groaned for what must have been the 50th time that day. "All right. Whatever. Let's go." As we swung on our backpacks and grabbed our other bags, the sky dimmed until it seemed only twilight remained. Jack sighed sharply, nodded at the three of us, then led the way. Into the weeping woods. I almost expected some supernatural shift in the air the moment we crossed that tree line, but it was as anticlimactic as you'd expect. If anything was off, it was the same stuff I'd already been bothered by. The extraordinary silence. The unusual darkness. And every so often, a pale limb fading into the gloom. We hiked on, our shuffling footfalls mingling with the sounds of creaking wood. Jack marked the trees as we went so that we'd be able to navigate back to the truck. "How far?" Marcus asked after some 30 minutes. However far we want, I guess," Jack answered. "There's nowhere specific for us to go?" Tina said. "Nah," replied Jack. "Once you're in, you're in. I just figured we'd go a good ways. We drove so far for this, might as well make it count, right?" "No," Marcus rebuked, "not right. We're stopping here." His bags thumped onto the forest floor. His backpack followed. I looked around. "Jack, is this spot okay?" "Good as any, I guess." "Then I'm cool with it. Let's make camp." The four of us got to work. It was dark enough then that we had to click on our flashlights. I raised the tents. Jack gathered firewood. Marcus got started on supper. And Tina set up some of the recording equipment. We didn't talk much for the next 20 minutes. I think we all felt the same yearning to be done with the work and settle in. It had been a long day, the type that strained the mind. We were ready to loosen up. Despite the autumn moisture over the wood, Jack managed to get a fire going at the center of camp. I pitched our 4 tents in a circle nearby, then unfolded our chairs right around the stone circle of the fire pit. Marcus placed the cooking pot by the flames, and the three of us sat down just as Tina finished with the tripods. The cameras and microphone has held an eerie sort of vigil around camp. I checked my phone as Tina took her seat across from me. It was 4:42 p.m. I looked up, straight up, and saw faint gray light peeking through the treetops. A breeze brushed fallen leaves past my feet. Marcus asked me, "Do you have any bars?" I glanced at my phone again, then shook my head. "Me neither," he went on. My reception dropped, one bar at a time, starting from the moment we turned onto that winding road. "I told you guys it was going to be weird," Jack mumbled. We spoke softly for a while longer as the stew broiled. Through that time every one of us kept looking over our shoulders. The way the darkness seeped into those woods was abnormal. By the time we grabbed our bowls and started to eat, it was pitch black beyond the nearest circle of trees. As we ate, the winds that had been hissing through the woods slowed. They'd still come every 10 or 20 seconds, but it was like the trees weren't moving in reply anymore. Instead of rustling leaves and creaking wood, I'd just hear an eerie sighing as the air wafted through. And that darkness. The dark encroached. Like it was alive. The shadows past the circle of trees pushed into our modest campsite, like they were trying to get to us. But each time that dark crawled forward, a crackling of our campfire would send it back. Of course, these were my imaginings, or so I thought at the time. "That was delicious," she chirped. "Thank you, Mark." "Don't mention it." "Well," she continued, "it's probably too dark to venture out or film much of anything, and yet it's too early to hit the hay. So, I suggest we just lean into the whole camping in the woods cliché and exchange ghost stories." I laughed. So did Jack. Marcus didn't. "Hell yeah," I said as I clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Come on, Marcus, surely you've got a spooky tale or two." So we sat around our little reservoir of warmth and light and told our cheesy ghost stories. To all of our surprise, the scariest story by far came from Marcus. It was a tale about the haunting of Little Landry. But that's a story for another day. Let's get back to the Weeping Woods. After a couple hours of hanging about, drinking tea, and discussing what we'd do come dawn, the four of us agreed to sleep early. We were exhausted after the long drive north and the trek through the woods, and the sooner we slept, the more energy we'd have to venture out at dawn. So we snuffed out our campfire, the embers hissing as cool water consumed them. And we crawled into our tents. There was one for each of us. Once I'd gotten my belongings in order and felt comfortable in my bedding, I clicked my flashlight off. A little light leaked in from the others' tents as they shuffled around. Then they turned the lights off, too. What remained was perfect, absolute darkness. I held my hand out right in front of my face and moved it side to side and couldn't see a thing. And apart from the odd cough or shuffle from one of my companions, the only noise that remained was the ethereal sighing of the wind. As creepy as it was, there was a certain coziness to being bundled up in a sleeping bag while surrounded by nature. Plus, as I mentioned, I was exhausted. So I managed to drift to sleep. The coming hours were marked by a fitful slumber. I had nightmares, there in that forest, but I couldn't tell you what they were about. It's like I know, but don't know. All I can say is that I was racked by dark dreams for the few hours that I was asleep. And then I woke to the sound of creaking wood. My breath caught in my throat when I heard it. Fear danced up my spine. I know, we were in the forest. Of course there was creaking wood. But no! This creaking was different. This creaking was long, slow, with whispers hidden within. This creaking was alive. Slowly, I sat up within my tent, head swiveling one way then the next in the dark as I tried to ascertain which direction the noise came from. But I couldn't. It was as though the sound came from all directions. There was no longer any wind, only the creaking. I wondered whether my friends were awake, too. If I was alone and hearing the sound, would they believe me if I told them about it come the morning? I considered calling out to them, but the truth was I was so damn scared in that moment that no words would have come. Images flashed in my mind as my imagination conjured a visage to match that horrible creaking. And then I heard it. I nearly missed it over the din of the forest. But I heard it. Jack's quivering voice, just barely louder than a whisper. He's here. Stay in your tents. Don't look at him. The way he uttered the words sent ice through my veins. My limbs grew as stiff as the tree trunks surrounding our camp as I held my breath and closed my eyes. The creaking came closer. I heard shuffling from one of the other tents. It made me angry. Who the hell was making so much noise? The whispering within the creaking grew louder. I could almost make out words within the hissing gibberish. And then a blinding light came on, so bright against the forest's dark that I noticed it through my eyelids. Instinctively, I opened my eyes and looked up. Through my tent's mesh fabric, I saw a figure standing with a flashlight in hand. By the shape and height and trembling of the figure, I knew it was Jack. Concern for my friend turned out to be a stronger force than that of fear. "Jack?" I gasped. "What are you doing?" He raised a hand in the direction of my tent. "Quiet. Close your eyes and be quiet." "I'm fine." The tone of his voice told me that I had to obey. I closed my eyes again and held my breath. The creaking drew even nearer. It sounded like it was just outside my tent. Wood, straining and flexing under a sort of weight. Jack's breathing had grown ragged. There were hints of whimpering accompanying each panting breath. I wasn't religious, but at that moment, I nearly started praying to whatever God might listen. I would have done so, in fact, if the creaking didn't stop. But it did. All at once, a sighing breeze washed over our campsite, and the oppressive, creaking presence that had stood among us was gone. And as I opened my eyes and saw a flashlight laying on the forest floor, I realized that Jack was gone, too. I crawled toward my tent flap and unzipped it. "Jack?" I called. As I ambled out, I saw Tina doing the same, her eyes wide in the dark. "He's gone," she whispered. A second later, Marcus's flap opened, and he poked his head out. His expression told me that he, too, had been awake for all of it. "Jack!" I cried, far more loudly than I was comfortable with. There was no reply. I picked up his flashlight, swinging it around in every direction, squinting into the gloom beyond the trees. There was nothing, no one. I pointed the flashlight at the ground where it had laid. An impression in the mulch clearly marked the flashlight, as well as the spot where Jack had stood, but there were no obvious marks leading away from there. Tina startled me as she barked a laugh. "Oh, this is great. This is absolutely fantastic." Scowling at her, I said, "What are you talking about?" "This is a prank." "Of course, it's a prank. And Jack got us good." She shook her head, chuckling. I tried to think clearly despite my racing heart. After a moment, I nodded. "I suppose that's the most logical thing to assume." "Are you kidding me?" Marcus whisper shouted. "You both heard the wood, didn't you?" "Yeah, but we're in a forest, aren't we?" I replied. "In a creepy forest, no less," Tina agreed. "I reckon Jack just pulled the prank of the century on us." She pointed at some of the recording equipment. "And he's got the whole damn thing recorded. We'll never live this down." "Right," I said. I told Marcus, we'll look at the footage. That'll settle your nerves, won't it? He nodded. Let's. Tina gathered the one camera that was pointed at our camp. It was cold, so I struck up another fire in the pit as she looked through the footage. I glanced at my phone as I settled into my chair. It was 12:15 a.m. Just past midnight. Huh, she burst out after another minute's searching. Told you so. She leapt from her seat, rounding the fire before crouching between Marcus and I. As she hit play on the camera, we saw a grainy image of our tents, lit only by Jack's flashlight as he stood amidst them, looking around. I briefly thought I could make out a couple pale figures in a dark background, but quickly dismissed the notion given how unclear the image was. Is there audio? I asked. Should be, yeah, answered Tina. Then why is there no noise? She shrugged. We must have been imagining things. A few tense moments of the video passed before Jack froze, his flashlight pointed in the direction of nothing that we could see. Maybe it was something off camera. The 50mm lens captured the breadth of our camp, but not much beyond it. Or maybe he was just pranking us, after all. In any case, he set the flashlight down, even as he craned his neck to keep his eyes fixed on whatever he was looking at. Then he walked in that same direction, the light shining brightly off his back as he went. He wasn't moving quickly or slowly, just steadily. And that confirmed that there was audio on the recording, because we heard the crunching of leaves as Jack departed. You see? Tina said as she hit pause on the video. Bastard pranked the hell out of us. She straightened, letting the camera rest on its strap, and cupped her hands around her mouth. Jack! Come out already. Prank's done, you win. If he was actually hiding somewhere in the dark, he didn't even make a peep. Tina called out a couple more times, and I even joined in on the last one, insisting that Jack come back. There was no answer. You still think this is a prank? Marcus asked. I looked at him, uncertain. Tina sternly said, yes. Marcus frowned. Then where the hell is Jack? Tina looked away. I stood up with a sigh. Look, whatever this is, we've got to track him down one way or another, right? We're in the woods and far from any sort of help. Even if this is just a really overdone prank, we can't risk him getting lost or hurt out there. Oh, fuck me, Marcus groaned as he pressed his face into his hands. Yeah, that's fair, Tina agreed. It's chilly. Let's bundle up a little, grab as many lights as we can carry, and head out. I'll also keep this camera running. I'll grab a knife, Marcus said. Tina and I looked at him uncomfortably. To mark the trees, he said as he rolled his eyes. So we can actually find our way back? Ah, I replied. Smart. A couple minutes later we set out into the forest, in the direction that the flashlight had been pointing when Jack left it. We called out his name, our voices losing some of their optimism with each repetition. Our lights were less effective than they should have been. The darkness seemed to devour them, making it hard to see farther than 20 or so feet ahead. Fear and frustration mingled in my chest as I looked left and right, peering through the trees, shouting as loudly as my courage let me. Jack! 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 Marcus cursed. I've marked 15 trees, guys. We should really turn back. Sure, I sighed. We'll head back, then start out again in a different direction. As we turned around, a sharp crack sounded. Tina screamed. Gasping and looking over at her, I braced for what I might see. What? Tina? What is it? She was looking down, with one hand placed over her chest. Oh. Oh God. She stepped back. Come look. Marcus and I padded towards her. A broken old bone lay in Tina's boot print. It's human, she whispered. What? I spat, genuinely startled. How do you know? Because I studied this sort of thing in a recent course, she hissed. That is, without a doubt, a human femur. Grimacing, I brushed the mulch aside with my boot, revealing more of the skeleton. Marcus gasped. You don't think? I frowned at him. You mean, I glanced back down at the skeleton. Oh. No, definitely not. These bones are old. There's no way. Maybe it's the guy who had parked his car at the edge of the woods, offered Tina. Maybe, I murmured as I uncovered more of the corpse. By the time I'd finished, the three of us were looking down on a full human skeleton. The hand's arms were folded over the ribcage, with most of the hand bones resting on the sternum at the center of the chest. Mixed in with those hand bones was a bundle of sticks. Jesus Christ, Tina muttered. She was still recording, making sure not to miss a thing. Let's hurry back, I said. A sense of dread was settling in. Maybe I was being impractical, but I couldn't help it. Marcus led the way, as he could best recognize the tree markings. Our pace was hurried. Frantic, even. Even Tina was spooked. The few times I looked at her, I saw her mouth pursed to a thin line. In hindsight, it's silly to think that it was the dead one that spooked us so much. The one we didn't even know. Marcus stepped back into camp and immediately gathered wood for a new fire. Tina paced back and forth, keeping to herself. I was antsy, restless, terrified. I feared the worst. We need to head out again. Jack is still out there. I took the day to gather my thoughts and calm myself. I'm ready to tell the rest of the story. Though I warn you, what came before was child's play in comparison with what comes next. Read on at your own risk. So, picking up right where I left off. I aimed my flashlight opposite from the way Jack had left, shining its light through a row of trees. And gasped. I saw a pair of legs, poking out from behind one of the trunks. By the style of pants, I knew at once that it was Jack. My heart hammering in my throat, I ran over. I rounded the tree trunk. And relief washed over me as I found him alive and seemingly unhurt. Jack! I cried as I lowered myself next to him. He didn't respond. Though I could clearly see the rise and fall of his chest, his eyes stared listlessly up at nothing in particular. His arms were folded over his chest, hands resting right at his center. In his hands was a bundle of sticks. Jack? Tina cried. Are you all right? What's wrong with him? Whispered Marcus. Not only did he not reply, he didn't even move. His eyes didn't shift. Nothing. This must be part of the prank, Tina muttered. I scowled at her. Weren't you worried just now? I trailed off as I recognized the confusion in her eyes. She wasn't thinking clearly. Hell, none of us were, at that point. We gotta get out of here, Marcus said. Tina replied, but the project. Look, I said, we'll come back for the equipment, and maybe we'll continue with the work, but right now we need to find Jack some help. I shook my head, grimace. He's not okay. How do we get him back to the truck? Marcus asked. Jack was a big guy, well over 6 feet tall. There was no way we'd be able to lift him all the way. Let's get him up and see if he'll walk between the two of us. Marcus nodded and we got to it. The bundle of sticks spilled onto the forest floor as we yanked him upright. Jack was limp as we raised him up, and even once we had him between us, his legs just dragged if we started to walk. Jack, enough already, Tina said. Her tone was desperate, not annoyed. "Joke's over." "Damn it," I cursed. "All right, Marcus, we'll take one arm each and drag him. There's not much else we can do. Tina, you got us. Take Jack's flashlight, the brightest one, and look for his markings. We need to get to the truck." She did as I asked, though she didn't say anything. She even set down the camera she had been so diligently filming with through the night, leaving it there by the tree. We set off. Marcus and I groaned as we pulled Jack, his legs leaving grooves in the mulch. We were facing away from Tina, so we had to manage in the dark. And that darkness felt like it was grabbing at us, seeping into us. It's hard to put into words, but it was an awful feeling. The ghostly sighing of the wind seemed louder now than it had been for most of the night. I wondered what time it was. Probably 1 or 2 a.m. A few hours from dawn. The next moment was the first of the expedition that truly damaged my mind. Marcus saw it first. He yelled in terror. I looked across to him and saw a skinny, pale figure, with limbs too long to be natural and flesh too ropey to be human. It was standing just close enough and with just enough faint light glancing off its skin that I was sure I was seeing true. The creature's drooped, twisted mouth parted to let out an agonized sigh as it lifted a lanky arm toward Marcus and I. I joined Marcus in screaming. We both tugged hard on Jack's arms and practically sprinted toward the glow of Tina's light. "What happened?" she gasped, spinning to shine the light right into our eyes. "There's something!" Marcus shrieked. "Run!" Was it the Woodwick Walker we had just seen? I wasn't sure, but the fact that we had both looked right at it and seemed fine told me that it probably wasn't. As we scurried through the woods, I kept glancing into the dark, fully expecting to see that horrid thing ambling after us. What happened instead was an abrupt ceasing of the wind and natural din of the woods. The way the sighing breeze and shifting branches ceased to make any noise at all caused the three of us to freeze in place. Again, I felt ice in my bloodstream. Marcus and I exchanged terrified glances. Then we heard it. Creaking wood. My heart raced. As the creaking grew louder, only one thought rang clear in my mind. I opened my mouth and whispered sternly to my friends. Marcus and Tina looked at me. Tina said, "Where would we even look?" "I don't know." "Anywhere. Pick a direction." I aimed my flashlight opposite from the way Jack had left, shining its light through a row of trees, and gasped. I saw a pair of legs, poking out from behind one of the trunks. By the style of pants, I knew. Geez, I'm sorry. As I mentioned at the start of this story, talking about this is difficult. Particularly once I get to this part. I realize this is abrupt, but I need to take a bit of time to gather my thoughts. To regroup. Give me a day, and I promise I'll get back to you with the rest of this story. In the meantime, I encourage you to avoid the woods if you can. You certainly won't find me within 50 miles of any forests. See you soon. Don't look at him. Marcus clenched his eyes shut. I looked down at Jack. He was still staring idly up at the sky. I clapped my hands over his eyes, then shut my own and held my breath. The whispering that was hidden in the creaking reached my ears, same as it had earlier that night. I strained to make sense of the whispers, but I couldn't, even though it felt like I should have been able to make out the words. When Tina spoke, my stomach sank. "Oh, fuck this," she hollered. "I'm not playing this stupid game anymore." "Tina, quiet," I whispered as softly as I could manage. She laughed. "Look at you two, with your eyes clenched shut. You're grown men, both of you. Give me a break." "There's nothing." She paused. There's nothing." While she didn't say anything else, her breath quickened. I heard a thud and through the lids of my eyes saw a shifting light. She had dropped the flashlight. A few soul-scathing moments passed before the creaking ceased. And when I opened my eyes, Tina was gone, though we hadn't heard her walk away. As expected. "It's over, Marcus," I quietly said. As Marcus opened his eyes, I saw his cheeks wet with tears. "We need to leave this place," he rasped. "Let's get Jack back to the truck," I agreed. Then I'll come back and find Tina." Marcus nodded. We got back to dragging Jack, pausing every few moments to shine the light over the trees to ensure we were going the right way. The woods were still pitch dark, and I hadn't forgotten about the awful pale creature that had approached us. The minutes or hours that passed before we made it back to the Silverado were nightmarish. But we did make it, finally. "Oh," Marcus moaned, "thank God." "Oh, God, thank you." We opened the back door and grunted as we shoved Jack up in there. Once he was securely in the truck, I turned back toward the Weeping Woods. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I'm not going back." "I know," I interrupted. "Stay and watch over Jack. If he takes a turn for the worse, leave without us. Get him to a hospital. Otherwise, give me a few hours, at least. I'll find Tina and get back." As I stepped back into the Weeping Woods, I marveled at my own courage. I suppose that, when you're faced with either taking on something terrifying or letting someone you care about die, the choice becomes easy. For me, at least, it was. But God, did I hate it. I felt like I was losing bits of myself as I stomped back into that loathsome place. At the edges of my vision, I kept seeing pale limbs and couldn't tell if they were just branches or actual monsters, but at that point it didn't matter. I was pressing on regardless. There was no use in scaring myself further. I assumed I'd find Tina laying listlessly somewhere like Jack had been. I also remembered that we found Jack right by the place where he'd first vanished. So I just followed the grooves Jack's legs had left in the mulch, retracing our path through the woods and hoping I'd spot Tina soon. Again, minutes or hours went by. It was impossible to tell in the woods and in the dark. I marched all the way back to our camp without finding Tina. Then I turned back and tried looking again along the same path. It was on the return trip that I saw her legs protruding from behind a tree. I ran over, calling out to her. She was laying there, blank eyes staring upwards, hands folded over her chest, with a bundle of sticks clutched firmly in them. I knew it was useless, but I still tried to rouse her. "Tina? Tina, please say something. Tina, are you okay? Can you hear me?" She didn't reply, didn't move. Angrily, I snatched her hand and tossed the sticks aside. "We're getting out of here," I whispered harshly as I lowered my arms under her back and legs and lifted her. Dawn had finally come, so I just left the flashlight behind as I struggled back in the direction of the truck. The pale creatures were all around me at that point, sighing in a sort of accursed chorus, ropey limbs reaching for me. A few of the pale hands actually brushed against me, the long, bony fingers running over my jacket. I ignored them and pressed on. Better this than the walker itself, I figured. And just as the thought crossed my mind, the sighing ceased. Total silence blanketed the woods. Silence until the disquiet creaking of wood reached my ears. It was the third time I'd faced it that night, but the first time I'd faced it alone. And that was the moment that truly ruined me. The moment that shook me so badly that it's haunted me in all the years since. I fell onto my knees, setting Tina down and placing a palm over her blank eyes. Somehow, in that moment of sheer terror, I couldn't bring myself to fully shut my own eyes. It just felt too vulnerable, I suppose. So, as the creaking grew louder, I tilted my head down and stared at the ground between my knees. A feeling in me prodded, urging me to look up, to see what it was that was approaching, to protect myself. I resisted. My eyes remained fixed on the mulch immediately below me. The whispering and the creaking was angry this time. There was a real hatred in it. I could sense it, though I still couldn't make out the words. Like the other times, I wasn't sure what direction it was approaching from. The creaking and whispering was all around. It was in my head. I held strong. I didn't look. Even when I could sense that something was right next to my head, its breath brushing the skin of my neck, I did not look. As it circled me, I saw one of its legs come into view. In the dim dawn light I saw a limb of both wood and flesh, broken and twisted down its length. Sap and blood seeped from the places where it had bent and fractured. Again, the temptation sounded in me to look up, at the thing's face. Again, I resisted. The thing started to make a new noise, from deep within its gullet. It was a wet, guttural croaking. It was a sound that can't be put into words. It was something that should not have ever been heard by anyone. I kept my eyes down as the thing circled me, breathed on me, croaked at me. For seconds that felt like minutes, that felt like hours, I stayed still. Until, finally, finally, it went away. The croaking turned to angry whispering, and the angry whispering turned to creaking as the walker left. Eventually there was no noise at all. Going entirely on instinct at that point, I gathered Tina into my arms again and set off in the direction of the truck. When we made it back to the clearing, Marcus merely gawked at me as I placed Tina in the back seat with Jack. I got into the driver's seat, twisted the ignition, and got us the hell out of there. Marcus and I didn't speak a word for the entire drive to the nearest hospital. The doctors and nurses did all sorts of tests, both in that Wayside, Pennsylvania hospital and at the far better ones back home. None of them could come up with anything useful. They mostly agreed that, at best, Jack and Tina were in some sort of catatonia, and that they might snap out of it one day. At worst, they were in a vegetative state that was irreversible. To this day, Jack and Tina are cared for in a special care facility. To this day, they're just as they were when we found them in those woods. Eyes staring blankly, bodies limp. My poor friends likely would have been put down by now, if not for one detail that tells us they're still there, in a way. They show a slow, steady interest in sticks, branches, things like that. They don't respond to anything else, but if there's a stick laying nearby, they'll start wading towards it. And when they've gathered a satisfactory bundle of the little pieces of wood, they'll place it against their chest and continue to hold it there. As for Marcus and I, well, Marcus and I never spoke again after that. I did try to reach out to him a few times, but he ghosted me. I can't say I blame him. What we went through was life-altering. He probably just wants to stay as far away from all of that as possible. I'm not sure what he's gotten up to in the years since. Myself? I finished my degree without bothering with the honors thesis. I actually lost my passion for social sciences altogether after what I went through. I've settled for an average job with average pay in a town that's as far away from any forest as can be. I've also cut down all the shrubs around my house. I even paid my neighbors, and this was a hefty sum, mind you, to get rid of their trees and bushes. I take time every day to rake my yard and get rid of any twigs that may have found their way onto my property. Even so, in my town far from any woods, and in my house cleansed of any twigs, oftentimes when I'm sitting indoors, just minding my business, I'll hear it. The unmistakable, horrible creaking of wood.